Now, from the perspective of non-ordinary states, what underlies this kind of problem would be some undigested memories of situations that actually were life-threatening, which would be like a near drowning or whooping cough or some kind of accident. And on a deeper level, it could be the vital threat that existed in birth canal during the birth process. And then behind it, transpersonally, there could be a past life experience of being killed or dying. So in the experiential process, these people always discover the source of this fear of death as being a situation that actually was a life-threatening situation. So the error of these patients is that they link somehow the fear to a current, the present process where it's actually the source of the fear is a situation which is life-threatening, so the feelings are real, but it's historically misplaced. And the resolution of that is to bring that fully into consciousness, relive that situation in the original context, and then express the feelings which are involved. A related problem is called nosophobia. I already mentioned that nosos is disease in Greek. So nosophobia is fear of disease. A thanatophobic patient feels that their life is threatened. They might die, which means they have a physical problem that's so serious that it's going to kill them immediately. It's a kind of an emergency sense. Whereas a person who is nosophobic has just the feeling that they have some disease, possibly even serious disease, but not one that would kill them today or tomorrow. Again, in the same way, what we find out is that the source of these various physical discomforts that they interpret as symptoms of a current disease are actually physical symptoms associated with some situation that belongs to the past. And the same approach to solution, of course, would be to bring that situation fully into consciousness and process the emotions and the physical feelings. Some patients have very specific fear of diseases. For example, cancerophobia. People don't just feel that they're sick, but they have very specific idea that they have a tumor. They feel pressure in the head and they're sure this is a brain tumor, or they feel pain in the back and they feel it's a metastasis into their spine. Today, a number of patients have phobia of AIDS. There's one specific form of phobia which has a somewhat different origin, which is called mysophobia, M-Y-S-O, which is a phobia of dirt, phobia of something that is unclean. Those are people who are sort of pathologically meticulous about cleanliness, people who wouldn't touch doorknobs except through a handkerchief, people who don't trust that plates or bowls, have been sort of adequately washed, and they have fantasies about situations that might have sort of contaminated these objects. For example, somebody went to the bathroom and didn't wash their hand, or the cook had her period and didn't wash her hands, and so on. So it's a fear of dirt, particularly biological dirt, which could endanger the person himself or herself, but very frequently they also feel that that would make them dangerous to others. They would get infected and then infect others. So there's an element of kind of an aggressive feeling towards oneself, but also towards others. That frequently leads to compulsive washing of hands. I've worked with patients who would wash their hands with a brush thoroughly 100 times a day until the hands were bleeding and they still didn't feel that the hands are clean. This can usually be linked to some kind of unpleasant contact with the biological material in birth, particularly a situation where some of that material is inhaled when there's a premature breathing and the biological material gets into the lungs. And so the child is aware, is in touch with the biological material, and at the same time it experiences different degrees of danger and discomfort because the breathing is obstructed. So what remains in the memory is a kind of a negative association between this biological material and fear. The next very interesting phobia that also exists in a number of people is called acrophobia, which is a phobia of heights. This is not a pure phobia like misophobia, which is a fear of dirt but also compulsive washing. Acrophobia is not a pure phobia. Usually people who are gifted in introspection will tell you that when they are somewhere in a high place, it's not just a fear of that height, but behind it is a compulsion to jump. So there's a sudden kind of unconscious impulse that emerges into consciousness, which is telling them jump. There's a kind of need to experience the fall, and then the fear then comes basically as a fear of that impulse that could sabotage us so that we could hurt ourselves. Now this is one that is not so easy to link to birth, although we see regularly that people in the very final stages of birth have experiences related to falling. For example, somebody in the breathwork session or a psychedelic session is reliving birth, and suddenly from there goes into an identification with a paratrooper jumping with a parachute, or suddenly has the identification with an Olympic athlete who is doing fancy diving into a swimming pool and so on. So there is a peculiar kind of mysterious connection between the final stages of birth and the experience of falling. There are different ways of thinking about it. One is possibly phylogenetic. There are species that actually deliver standing. For example, a giraffe delivers standing. So for the little giraffe, birth is quite a drop. In cultures that don't have obstetricians, women typically don't deliver on their backs. That's the worst possible position. So women who have their own choice, follow their instincts, they would deliver squatting or on all four, or in some cultures even standing, sort of maybe suspended on a branch. This was, for example, something that was shown in the movie The Little Buddha, when Queen Maya is delivering the Buddha. She's delivering him standing. But in any case, so there's a possibility of falling, and there's certainly a first encounter with gravity. So for some reason, there's some similarity between, or some connection between the experience of falling and the final stages of birth. So people who are acrophobic typically discover that connection. We had a very interesting man in our workshop at Hollyhock. He's in British Columbia, who was from Germany, but he lived at the time in Canada, but he was in Germany through the Second World War. And before the war, when Hitler came to power and they were preparing the Olympics, there was a strong sort of ideological element. They wanted to show the supremacy of the Nordic race. So there was tremendous investment in winning in the Olympics. So some outstanding athletes were put into special camps where they would undergo real drill, real training. And for the men, this was an alternative to going into the army, into the Wehrmacht. And this man was kind of a talented athlete. He was also a pacifist. He didn't want to be in the army. So he was in one of these camps. And they were grading, very strictly grading all the performances. And the athletes who didn't live up to the expectations, they were sent to the army. And he was kind of lagging behind. He didn't have enough grades. And he came into a situation where he had a chance to get a lot of grades, but it was something that he never had done before, which was dive head first from a tower, which was, he said, about 60 feet, and sort of do a perfect dive into the swimming pool. At the beginning of this workshop, he told us that he was suffering from phobia of heights, and during the experience, he had this very powerful insight into it, where he actually linked it to 3 situations. It's like a constellation of memories on different levels. I talk about this sometimes as a coexistence, a system of condensed experience, where the first part of it was a reliving of the situation in the Olympic camp, when he suddenly found himself standing on this high tower, facing the situation, either you do this or you go to the army. There was tremendous conflict, and finally doing it, forcefully overcoming his anxiety. And then from there it went to the final stages of birth, and then when he completed that, then suddenly he was like in what he felt was a past life, in a culture that he felt was something like New Guinea, he was an adolescent boy involved in a rite of passage, where what they did, they built a tower, made of poles, trunks, and so on, and they would take lianas and bind one end of the liana to the top of the tower and the other one on their ankles, and they were jumping from the tower head first, and it was a kind of a status symbol in this group to have the longest liana and not to get killed. The head comes as close to the ground as possible. So this was like a coax system, very, very deeply, meaningfully related to his phobia of heights, which had these two experiences of falling on both ends, one biographical, one transpersonal, and in the middle was the experience of the final stages of birth.